All right. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Mike Mooney. I'm the digital marketing manager here at TPGI. Excited to have our first Ask Me Anything session with Mark Miller and Matthew Atkinson on digital accessibility. So I hope you brought your questions because they're ready to answer them. Before we get started, just want to go over a few housekeeping items. First off, this session is being recorded, and we will share the recording once the session has concluded and everything's been processed. We do have captions available. Feel free to use those as needed. And lastly, if anyone needs any accessibility support, training, usability testing, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to help you with your projects. And with that, just to kind of get things started, I want to ask the first question. What is digital accessibility? So Mark, if you want to take that away, we can get started.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And thanks everyone for coming on their lunch break. I'm assuming if you're on the East Coast that you could be having a sandwich or something right now, but instead you're hanging out with us, and maybe you're doing both. So we really do appreciate it. And we're excited to hear the questions that you guys have. So the first question, what is digital accessibility? That is a huge question, of course, right? So I'm going to try to boil it down into just a basic answer here, mainly for the purpose of level setting the conversation, so we all kind of know what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about these things. So digital accessibility really is making any digital property usable by people with disabilities. Oftentimes when we think of digital accessibility, we think of things like websites. We think of applications, right? That could be maybe an application you're accessing via the web. We all know that a lot of the there's a whole SaaS world out there where a lot of the tools that we use even in our job are web-based applications. But of course, it could be any application that you're accessing. And sometimes people don't stop to think that even the documents that we interact with, particularly PDFs, but even Word documents and PowerPoints and things like that, all can fall under this broad kind of umbrella of digital accessibility. So just think about it as digital content that, and when we're talking about accessibility, we're really asking the question or trying to make sure that that can be usable by people with disabilities. That's my quick answer on it. I don't know. Did I miss anything, Matthew?
No, I think that's it's really comprehensive. And I would perhaps only add that that's the end goal, and the most impactful way to get to a product or service that's accessible at the end is to consider it as early as possible in the development life cycle. So the earlier that you bring on accessibility experts or think about accessibility, definitely the better. Yeah, that's all I would add.
Wonderful. And we're all experiencing digital properties right now because we're using Zoom to have this conversation. So we're actually a living example, and hopefully it's as accessible as it can be.
Yeah, and one thing I forgot to add in the intro is, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A box to ask your questions. We have a couple coming in now, but just want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable submitting those questions. All right, so first question, it's kind of a long one, so kind of bear with me on this one. I recently hired from scratch a website designer and persuaded him to use the Figma platform in lieu of his normal design tool, Adobe XP. He recently sent me a wireframe in which I now presently have the obligation of making comments, corrections, and suggestions in practice. How many designers ask for and receive detailed feedback from their clients in the wireframe to operating prototype stage from their clients? So that's like one question. And Jacques, do you want to clarify maybe on like, is there something around accessibility that you want to add to that? That just seems more of like a general
detailed accessibility feedback. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
So I have a couple of thoughts on that. I'm not sure how close this will get to an answer for you. We often see tools like this being used by UX to produce the designs, and then they're passed on to developers to implement them. And it's always important, as I just mentioned, to consider accessibility early on. And it's really common for UX to use these sorts of tools. So this isn't quite at the stage of being a prototype. It's not interactive. It's a visual design tool. But one of the most helpful things from an accessibility perspective, when you're using a tool like this, you can do a lot of the visual stuff, of course, because it's visual by default. But one of the things to ask your designers to think about is things like keyboard interaction. So if they have a particular control there, especially if it's a custom control, ask them to indicate how they think that would be used by somebody that doesn't use a mouse. So what would the keyboard shortcuts be? What would the keyboard operation be? Think about things like which things would be in focus and in what order, so they can be reached and operated with the keyboard. And then another thing to think about from an accessibility perspective with these sorts of designs is that you can, like most of the time, for example, when you've got a form, the form controls will have visual labels, or at least hopefully they will. So it's obvious what they're called. But sometimes you might have buttons that just have, say, a trash can icon or something for delete. And it's really important from a UX, like a listen and feel perspective, for those sorts of names for things to be consistent. So it's a good idea for UX people to consider, what would this be announced like by a screen reader, for example? So would it be delete? Would it be trash? Would it be remove? Which is most appropriate given your app? Because one of the problems that we see in practice is if these aren't specified in the designs, then individual developers will be compelled to just do the best they can on the spot, and then you end up with inconsistency, and inconsistency is not good for UX generally, and it's also not good for accessibility. Not sure if that gets to the crux of the question, but hopefully it helps.
Yeah, and I'll jump in just in more general terms here. If the question here really is, is it appropriate, or should you have comments or solicit comments in terms of where you might, in terms of accessibility in design, the answer is kind of a big yes. And we do it a lot, right, with our clients. They ask us, they send us wireframes, Figma files, whatever, and we look those over and do it. What you're looking for, however, is slightly different than if you were to review a complete code base, generally speaking. And what I mean by this is there's certain aspects or certain failures that you can detect in the guidelines early on, right? Color contrast and tabbing order and a few things that are exposed at that design phase. But what's more important, or what's equally important in that design phase, is understanding sort of best practices, because you can set yourself up for much more success and ease of including accessibility down the road if you understand certain considerations of the design phase that may affect accessibility. So generally speaking, I think this is a resounding yes, that I don't know if it's normal practice, but it hopefully becomes more and more normal practice that you're looking at those designs. And it leads right to Matt's earlier point about including accessibility at the beginning of the process. There's many ways to do that in manually inspecting your designs for accessibility issues and design considerations that could lead to more accessibility down the road is certainly one of them. The other question is should Mike unmute himself before he reads the questions out loud to us? Yes, you should.
Mute always gets me.
Doesn't it? Doesn't it?
Thanks for the heads up. So got another question here. What are your favorite accessibility testing tools?
So that's a good question. It's a bit of a loaded question because TPGI creates some accessibility tools, but I'd like to think that we create the best accessibility tools. So let me give you the rundown from our perspective, and then maybe Matthew, if you want to jump in, if there's any tools I miss. I don't want to just answer that with our tools, but I'm going to start there. So Arc Toolkit, if you're looking for free tools that are out there, our Arc Toolkit is extremely good. You can find it on our website. It can work with multiple browsers, and that is a single page scanning tool. So what that does is it scans the page for failures to the WCAG guidelines that are detectable through automation. So one of the things to understand about any scanning or any automated scanning of a page or an entire site is that no matter what anybody tells you, it can't catch everything. And roughly speaking, depending on the nature of that page, you're probably catching somewhere between 30 and 40% of the issues. So that's the first thing to understand about those tools is they provide great insight. They're incredible aspects of an overall strategy, but you're not going to find something that's complete. Automation can't be complete. So I would download the ARC Toolkit. There's some other ones out there like Wave and Jim Thatcher's Flavlets, and we have a nice contrast tool out there as well that you can find on our website. I like the ARC Toolkit because of its UX and its presentation, and it also does things like overlay tabbing order. It's a game changer when you're trying to correct tabbing order when you see an overlay or overlay the alt text on a page. So now you're not looking at the code trying to go like, is my alt text appropriate? And you're reading the code and you're like, oh, what's this image? You're actually looking on the page and going, here's the image in context of the page. This is what it says. And assuming you understand kind of the decision tree around how alt text should be handled, it's in your face, here's the alt text on the page on this image. So that manual job of really making sure that, and those are just two examples, is done easier. So I love that tool. We're going to talk all day long about the ARC platform for an overall monitoring tool. It's very good. And that is to monitor through automation your website over time. It integrates in an incredibly in-depth knowledge base of best practices in multiple areas of this discipline. So design, web, even project management, all that. There's tons of knowledge base in there. There's e-learning in there. There's all sorts of stuff in there. That's a paid tool. It's also how we deliver manual reviews. I can't really speak about the other paid tools, and just out of sort of responsibility shouldn't, because I don't use them. We don't have them. So anything I would comment on those would be unfair. But if you're looking for that overall solution, that sort of single area of truth, I would really, and we're always happy to demo that. I would take a look at that. And then the other tool I would, a lot of people don't realize is out there is we're very fortunate about 4 or 5 years ago to be pulled in under the Vespero umbrella. And that puts us as sister companies with Freedom Scientific that creates JAWS, right? Everybody knows JAWS. So through that partnership, there's actually been a tool developed called JAWS Inspect that outputs, it's the JAWS engine, but the output that normally would be in speech is in text. And it's in multiple report formats. So it does two things. It helps flatten that learning curve. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to test with a screen reader that is not a screen reader user, but it's tough. It takes over a year typically to become kind of proficient as a screen reader tester. And that's not like, hey, I'm one of the best screen reader tester, and that's like just a proficient level. But JAWS Inspect can glean a lot of user experience information very quickly that you can learn how to use it in a matter of days versus that kind of period of time. Multiple reports, it can listen to what you're doing. It can even provide transcripts of your automated test scripts. So some of the practices you may already be doing in QA, you can have you can add more value to by being able to come out of that automated test script in QA with an entire transcript of what JAWS would have spoke during that test script. So I won't go too deep into that, but that's another one to look at. And also JAWS Connect it's not really a testing tool, but it's a method to solicit usability feedback from real screen reader users. What it does is when you activate JAWS Connect on your website, if a JAWS user comes to that website, they're going to in their link list. So insert F7 for anybody who knows their JAWS out there, is that list of links. And the very first thing that's going to give in that list is a form specifically designed for that JAWS user where they can give feedback on that page, whether that's to report an issue or to say they appreciate that you've thought about accessibility and they're having an easy time, or whatever it is. And it doesn't collect any private information or anything that they don't want to collect. They can kind of control even whether or not their name and email comes across. What am I missing, Matthew?
I think that's a very good selection. I would say totally +1 to all of that. Arc Toolkit is really good for getting started, getting your toes in the water. The color contrast analyzer is actually a standalone app. It doesn't go inside a browser, so you can use it for native apps as well on the operating system that you're using. A couple of things I would say, slightly out of scope for this question, but there's no substitute for getting people with disabilities to actually use your product. But if you're talking about testing during development and you want to check that you're doing things correctly as you go, then the tools that Mark mentioned are great. But there is one situation you may find yourself in, which is if you're in a locked down environment and you just don't have the permissions to install anything. Well, we'd urge you to ask a person that does to put Arc Toolkit in the browser for you. But if you don't have the ability to do that, if it's completely set in stone, at least for the current time, you can find out quite a bit of accessibility information that's exposed by the browser to the user's assistive technologies in the DevTools. In Firefox, it's its own DevTools panel, which is called accessibility, which is along the top, along with elements, the element inspector and the console and the other ones. In Chrome, Chromium, Edge, and the browsers based on that engine, it is a side pane within the elements panel, and it will show you something called the accessibility tree, which is the sort of subset of the DOM tree that the assistive technology gets given, and it will help you check on things like, have you named your controls properly, and have you structured your tables properly, and that sort of thing. It will tell you what information is exposed to the assistive technology. That doesn't guarantee that the assistive technology is going to interpret it in the way that you expect. So again, I would urge you to check with assistive technologies and users, but it does give you a really helpful debugging tool, especially if your HTML markup is complex. It's really easy to see that you've structured things like tables correctly using those tools. The thing that the Arc Toolkit extension does on top of that, and sort of complementary to that, is it analyzes that sort of information and then tells you in more sort of understandable terms what the problems are. So there's definitely a huge amount that you can't do with the browser built-in tools that things like Arc Toolkit can. But if you need fundamental information, you know, your vital stats for your accessibility, you can get to that in the browser. And then I'd also say test it using it with the keyboard. Make sure that you can see where the focus is, what you're interacting with, because lots of assistive technologies emulate a keyboard as part of their operation. And I think that's it.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a good list. I have a follow-up question here on Arc Toolkit, actually. With Arc Toolkit, have some of the features like showing the headers, landmarks, alt tags visually on the page restored?
Yeah, some of them have been restored. So I'll back up and just give everyone some insight in terms of where that question's coming from. Arc Toolkit was recently just revised, right? A completely new release of it. So for those of you who have been used to using it, you probably noticed a complete shift in the UX and the design of the toolkit itself. In that release, some of the favorite features, like the overlays I was talking about, didn't come out immediately. I don't have a comprehensive list in front of me. I believe there's release notes out there that can give you that. I think we even have them on a blog. But so the long story short is that a lot of that has been restored to date. They've been pretty rapidly bringing that back up to where it was in terms of some of those features, but I know it's not completely done. So if there's something that's just not there, the answer is it's probably that you probably are trying to use the one, you know, one of the few things that we haven't got back to updating. So keep at it and just keep looking. And I don't know if somebody maybe can find those release notes and pop them into here before we wrap up. If not, jump onto our website and dig in. But we are working hard to get that to a complete state.
Yeah, and I'll share those notes with everyone as a part of like resources after the session.
Great.
Another question here. I'm sure there are more than one reasons, but do you have an idea of why accessibility initiatives fail?
Oh, geez. All right. No more questions. We're going to spend the rest of the time. Yeah. So I'll try to answer this kind of as general as possible, because as you put in your question, like there's a ton of reasons why accessibility initiatives fail. I think that it depends, right? It depends on even what you're talking about. So if you're talking about, a small to mid-sized business, the general answers are probably different than an enterprise. But I'd say probably one of the reasons is just like focus and evangelism or buy-in, right? So in my experience, and I've been doing this for a long time, and let's just say we're talking about like a small to mid-sized company, we will see a litigation or some other sort of hot thing come across that lights everybody up about accessibility, and that causes kind of a flurry or a frenzy, and usually leads to a manual review. Hopefully it leads to some automated monitoring, and during that time everybody loves to talk about how they want to do something that is ongoing and sustainable, and in all these things. The reality is there's probably a demand letter, or there's some action that gets settled out of that, and once that happens, priorities shift away from accessibility. If you're lucky, it kind of hangs on, but we definitely see a shift. I mean, it's like anything else, right? It takes time, it takes money, and if somebody's going, "Bah, we got to get this feature out now," and that's what's more important than anything in the world, or we're an e-commerce site, it's December, like you're talking about accessibility, like we're just trying to keep the site up. We got to, everybody's hitting it and buying their presents right now. You know what I mean? There's different reasons why that the next thing is hotter than accessibility. So that would be the number one reason, and I think that's pretty normal. And then we see when that iterates a couple times, it'll eventually stick. So it's got to get hot again, and you've got to go, oh no, we should have paid attention before, like we said we were going to, and now, now it's coming up again, and we really need to pay attention to this time. So 2 or 3 times into that, I think that you see it stick. The other big problem I see is people try to take on too much all at once. Accessibility is a journey. It's not a light switch, right? And you're always going to start in a project way, right? Let's get a manual review done. Let's address some issues. Let's do some monitoring. Project. Right. And what you're trying to do is evolve that project into a process and then mature that process over time. So the thing to ask is not what are all the things we need to do for accessibility? Let's try and do them all. It's what do we need to do now? What's priority now? And once we do that, what is the next logical step? And once we're settled with that, how can we build on that? How can we build on that? How can we build on that? And when we partner with our customers, that's really where we try to get them. And it's hard sometimes to contain that, because when people are excited about accessibility, they're excited about accessibility, or when it's an urgency, it's an urgency. But you have to kind of go, whoa, slow down. Is this the priority right now? And does this make sense to do without these other things in place? We've been around the block a lot, so it's very easy for us to say this is the next thing you should do. If you're trying to figure that out on your own, it's very easy to make mistakes. And I think that that type of activity, too much all at one time or too quickly, and then secondarily sort of getting the priorities of things wrong and having focusing on something you're not ready to focus on. That would be my quick, without getting into technical details, kind of broad brushstrokes of what I think are causes of failure. Anything to add to that, Matthew? I know you're probably not looking at that on like I am all day, but maybe you are.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd like to answer an ever so slightly different question, which is, what can you do to make it succeed? And I would say keep talking about it. That is the main the absolute main thing is communication. I mean, communication and education are huge problem solvers, but communication can be difficult, especially if it's anything bigger than a really small company. And if it's a small company, it can be, resources can be difficult. But in a sort of medium or larger company, you'll often find that there's people there who want to make things accessible because it's the right thing to do. They're developers, they're UX, they're whoever they are, they want to do the right thing. And I would say if you've got people like that, or if you can find people like that in your team, empower them by having them hook up with each other, communicate with each other, giving them the time to communicate with each other, sharing what they've learned. It's often, this sort of thing is often called accessibility champions or any sort of similar initiative. And it's just building capacity within the team, or nurturing the capacity within the team, and giving them the space so that if accessibility issues come up, they have the time to actually address those as a priority. And people like to share knowledge and learn from each other, so that you can have this grow organically as long as you give it that nurturing time to do so. And I think that's really an important thing. And as Mark was saying right at the start, if you bring on somebody, some accessibility specialist, it might be because you've realized you've got problems to fix, and right then is maybe not the time to be taking on everything. As Mark said, first of all, you might want to say, well, what are the major problems? How can we fix them in the system that we've got? And then once you've maybe done a bit of training as well, or just got used to it, you then start thinking, okay, well, we've got a redesign coming up. Let's try and incorporate some of this into our redesign. And as things get redesigned, it will become more accessible. That's another thing that you can do to make it more sustainable. But absolutely, it's not usually possible to take anything like all of that on at once. So definitely walk before you run as a good piece of advice, as Mark said.
And I'll add one thing, because I think that's fantastic stuff, Matthew. And I'll just add one thing to it, that when you get executive level buy-in, the game changes. So evangelizing to that exec suite is a huge part of this. So the community building is fantastic, but now that community contains somebody at the C-level, it's the dialogue, the narrative shifts completely. So if your question is really around like, how do I evangelize, or if that's part of what you're thinking, you know, as you ask a question like that, really consider those executives levels as you're evangelizing, and just realize the effect that they can have on that program.
Yeah, that's great. And it seemed to resonate with some of the people here today. Great point. Keep accessibility in the conversation. Yeah, keep building community is good. So I think that does make sense, and kind of, you know, answers this next question here, but I'll also read it out in case you want to share anything else around that, which is, what strategies help lead towards more buy-in from decision makers, stakeholders, especially to develop a path towards an accessibility program for organizations. So any like additional comments on that?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic follow-up to the previous question. And you know, the answer is that there's you know, you've got to do a little bit of listening and responding, first of all, like going out there, like if I gave you a list of actions and just sort of bowling out there with those actions is probably not the way to handle it. It's probably to start, as Matthew pointed out, that dialogue, and then based on the dialogue and what you're learning for that dialogue, that can really inform the thing, you know, what you can do. But I think that at a high level, there's several things that you can do. I think one, like, let's just say you're not doing anything at all. Maybe there's not a burning activity occurring like legal action that's causing everybody to react, but you as an individual have decided that this is a value you'd like the company to recognize and move forward with. From a technical standpoint, you know, that's where automation really can come in and become an ally for you, because automation is very inexpensive. and you can very quickly understand the state of accessibility. So, and when we talk about that executive level, they love numbers and graphs and that kind of stuff. So your automation can give you that. So for very short money, you could actually start making improvements to automation, but also start to gain insight just in terms of the condition of your digital products, digital assets, so that you can start to talk about them in more business terms. There's some great writing out there, and we're doing some great writing out there on the return on the ROI surrounding accessibility. And I made that mistake for a reason, not just because of my dyslexia. But we're looking to redefine it as ROA, which is return on accessibility. And understanding those things can help with that evangelization. Evangelization is the big activity, right? Meaning let's try to get everybody on board. I think it's a fancy word for let's get everybody on board, right? Let's convince them they want to go on this cruise. That, there's all sorts of really good points. I mean, there's curb cutout effect is a great point, which is where that's a fancy industry term for adding accessibility often helps all of your users. So curb cutouts are those little ramps in the sidewalk that were originally part of the requirements of the ADA for people with who used wheelchairs so that they could access sidewalks easier, right? Just flat out. What parent pushing their child in a stroller hasn't used a curb cutout? What about when you're traveling and you got that heavy roller bag, right? Because you gotta bring everything. You can't decide what outfits you want all week. You got to cram everything in there. So you're dragging that heavy roller bag, and all of a sudden that curb cutout becomes your friend to get that roller bag up it. If you're skateboarding, you're awling onto the curb, so it's not for skateboarders, but bikers or whomever else might be moving on wheels is going to use that. And there was even a study that it was somewhere between 80 and 90% of the people will move and walk up, who are just walking without any of these things going on, will go over to the curb cutout and walk up the curb cutout versus stepping up the step. So intended for people who are in wheelchairs and similar assistive devices, but a benefit to all of us. So that happens from a digital standpoint. The number of people with disabilities that have disposable incomes is staggering. I don't have those statistics in front of me, but there's statistics that are out there. So say you have an e-commerce site and you're not accessible to screen reader users or other people with disabilities, you're actually ignoring and communicating to a large community with disposable income that you do not want their business. That tends to get people's attention when they realize that. This next one is huge, I think. Everybody thinks about this and they think, oh, people with disabilities, that guy that was born blind, or maybe we think about somebody who went overseas and had something awful to them happen and that was in the military or something like that. But we tend to have this dramatic view of disability. And the reality of it is that as we all age, we start to collect disabilities. Our vision starts to go, our hearing starts to go, our mobility starts to decline. Those people that are using your site today or that used your site yesterday are gonna want to keep using your site. And they're going to start relying on accessibility and assistive technologies more and more as they age. And so it really, when you think about it that way, it becomes an absolute necessity. And even somebody who sprains their wrist and can't use their mouse is going to appreciate we call that like a temporary disability. It's going to appreciate the fact that your keyboard accessible all of a sudden, because they're going to do more with the keyboard. Power users, right? To go back to the curb cutout effect. My son is a developer. He touches the mouse as little as he possibly can because it slows him down. It frustrates him when he runs across something that doesn't work like it's supposed to with the keyboard. And this is somebody who, we're going the other direction, right? This is somebody who's a power user. So understanding, and I just tried to touch on a few of them to make my point, but understanding those things and being able to articulate those things internally will start to bring people into the fold and bring people into understanding. And then, as Matthew says, community, a group of people who want this. Look at your DEI programs and see if they think about accessibility within the DEI programs. Look at the values that your company posts and see if those values are in there. If they're in there, leverage them. If they're not, lobby for them to be in there, right? There's a lot of things that you can do. I'll stop now. I could keep going forever, but and Matt, if you dare, after my long explanation, add to it, feel free.
I love that. I often sort of challenge developers. You know, as developers, that using the keyboard is cool. So make sure you can use the keyboard with your app, with your service. There, definitely. No, that's really great stuff.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, good answers. Good feedback and insights. This question is from Ingrid, and it says, how do you feel about the challenges, excuse me, how do you feel about the challenges that differ between accessibility experts who are external consultants, i.e. brought on in a contract basis, versus those that are internal to the company, employed by the company with the accessibility problems? In both situations, how can these groups work together or make the most of their position?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, again, it's the answer is going to be kind of the same. Like, it just really depends. It depends on the company, what they're doing, the level of expertise that internal person has. If they're newer to accessibility and they're kind of taking on the challenge, then they're going to rely much more on that third party just for education, all that kind of stuff. I think that if you swing the pendulum the other way and you have like a true expert there, that third party becomes an objective opinion, right? So it's great that you agree that your stuff is accessible, but to have a third party say we're in agreement too, or I think that that's one area that it fits, but also anybody who's internal is going to be in that sort of sandbox, right? So if you're internal and you're an e-commerce person, eventually you're going to become really good at accessibility as it relates to e-commerce, and specifically as it relates to e-commerce. Maybe you're using Shopify, Demandware, you're going to become really good at all of those things. And what happens is, if you start to shift technology, or just by nature of the fact that you're sort of isolated in this one type of group, there could be things that you're missing. So a lot of the relationship that we have with groups like that is because we see everything in every vertical all the time, and we're showing up to all of the industry events and listening to the industry news. We are on the cutting edge. We're floating right on top of the surface all the time. So we can really help from a techniques, from a evolution standpoint, all that kind of stuff, make sure that that internal group is staying as current as possible, and not kind of missing things because they're focused in one area. So it's hard to be as much of an expert as a third party is going to be. That's what I'm trying to say there, right? So you always probably want that third party expertise. And then the big way that we really partner with groups who have strong teams. So we're talking about centers of excellence that are 16, 20, 30 people, whatever, big, in an enterprise level, is that they start to use our tooling. So we talked about tools, right? If we really want to go deep into this, there's tools that help you do consistent manual reviews, and we have an entire platform and tool that works in sync with the platform, the ARC platform I was talking about, where your team can start to act like a third party would, and create audits and do audits and go through a guided manual process so that you're consistent from tester to tester to tester. And then you're also have access to our knowledge bases, our e-learning, our team for further help desk questions. That's the other place, right? When you do hit the end of your knowledge, we're here to answer those questions beyond that through our help desk. So we actually, it's kind of funny because people say, oh, you're always trying to work yourself out of a job, because we're trying to empower groups exactly in that way. We're trying to empower every single one of our customers to become that level of expert, so that our ongoing relationship is all those supportive things versus a reliance on us for every little move you need to make from an accessibility standpoint, because that is not sustainable. It's not efficient. And it's because that progression doesn't occur, as we discussed way early at the top of the call, that you have failure in the programs. That should be kind of in the back of your mind, an ultimate destination. I'm gonna pause because I'm sure Matt has a much more coherent, succinct answer to this than I just gave.
I would definitely agree with that. I think some of the most rewarding engagements that we've worked on are where there is an established team. Maybe it's a team that we helped the organization to establish, and that's kind of the apex of a really long-term relationship. And our involvement does change over time, as Mark suggested. Yeah, I think the person who is embedded within the organization is always going to know far more about the organization and be able to achieve that community, that communication within the organization, because they are part of it. I mean, I've even been embedded in certain clients for multiple years and still don't know everybody and are constantly trying to form relationships with new people and stuff. But if you're in the organization, it can be easier, and you can get a much better idea of the sorts of things that are possible, and the timeframes and the constraints and all the details of the technologies being used. And that's really helpful for building capacity within your own team. But you might well find that it's sometimes things get really complex, and you need somebody that is got the sort of broader industry experience. I totally agree with everything Mark's mentioned, and whilst, say, for example, the human consultancy time might well taper off, having access to the knowledge base is very useful to just as a reference, to go back to. So definitely we would aim to work ourselves out of a job in that respect, but there's all this reference material that's available. And also just a quick flavor of the level of industry involvement. Myself and many of my colleagues, I can think of at least 5 off the top of my head, are heavily involved with organizations like W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, that sets the standards, or at least most of the standards that make the web work. And we have very good collaboration with other standards organizations as well, and involvement with them. So we kind of have the broad view as to the things that are coming up as well, what's being worked on, what's being researched, what's in development. So there's that kind of aspect of it as well, and we love to share the expertise that we have based on that, and that all filters down into the knowledge base and in day-to-day questions and answers and all that sort of stuff as well. So yeah, the two are very, very complementary, and the more we can build capacity for the internal teams, the better. And yeah, that's enough from me, I think.
Awesome. I know we're kind of well over time here, and appreciate everyone sticking with us. One more question I wanted to kind of surface before parting. How do I start thinking and planning with accessibility in mind? I know it's kind of a broad question, but wasn't sure if you want to add some insights into that.
Well, it sort of depends on where you are in the process. And I'm assuming by nature of the question, you mean that you're at the beginning of the process. And I think that I would start to educate as much as you can, even if it's in simple ways. Like, for example, our platform's very inexpensive to get into it. So some people will just buy a seat to it, just have access to our e-learning. And just basically going through some of those e-learning modules so that you have, you get that kind of baseline of what is this effort really about? Not here's specific techniques, but you go through and you learn some of those specific techniques and you're like, I kind of get this. right? You know, like Matthew was saying before, like just a keyboard accessibility is so important. I get it, you know, or I get, you know, some of the basics around, you know, a screen reader needs the page structure to be right, and to have anything that's not that's visually represented have a text or auditory equivalent, and some of those things that just get you thinking a bit like an accessibility person. And then I would look immediately into having your designs looked at. That's probably the first tangible output you're going to have is those designs. You can certainly, we have a module on user stories, so you can certainly think about it when you're creating your user stories. And we can look at that kind of thing for you if you want, but the design is probably the most important first place for us to step in. And then as you develop using that information, using some of the knowledge, maybe even a help desk, so that you can ask some questions. The idea is your first time through is not going to be brilliant, right? Because it's going to be new and there's no way to kind of close that learning curve completely for you. So I think just your willingness to learn a bit and to have something like your designs reviewed, and that's a great place to start. But every time you iterate, you're going to become better and better and better and better. And the idea is each time, like the game you're playing with yourself is how few issues can they find when we have somebody like TPGI come in and do a final review of that code base, right? Your first time through, we're still going to find quite a few. Maybe your second time through, you knock it down a bit. You know, I mean, it depends on it. But that's kind of the game that you're playing during that process is how can I jump in here and how can I gain knowledge? How can I bring them in at the right point? You know, your tooling, grab your tooling. Your tooling is a great place to start too. Something like Art Toolkit, and start to you know, look at code with that even before you've finished your website. You can use Art Toolkit as you're developing. If you're thinking about that at a larger scale, I'm just trying to interpret a little bit where the question's coming from. If you're thinking about that from a larger scale, all those things still apply. But if you're in an enterprise and you have a CI/CD pipeline, you can bring accessibility testing and checks into that CI/CD pipeline. You can shift completely left with them. Our API is wide open, so you can you know, Jenkins or Azure DevOps or whatever you're using, you can connect to our API and pull those in, or use our SDK and include accessibility checks in it. So from the standpoint of where, you know, where to start in the SDLC, I would start there. I would start with automation. Automate wherever you can, even though it's not complete. It makes things easier because when you take that layer that could be got through automation off, you now make the job of people who are doing more manual things much easier. And you have a data set that can give you an indication of whether or not you've got failures going on. But anyways, I'm going off on a tangent a bit. Anything to add, Matthew?
Yeah, again, very much building on what Mark said. I think the trick is the fact that you're asking the question is a brilliant first step. Not taking on too much at once, doing that bit of education. There's a lot of online, so as well as the knowledge base in ARC, which gives you code level what explanations of how to solve problems, the tutor section is like e-learning stuff and different modules on different things. And there are, as Mark said, general ones about accessibility awareness, about disability awareness as well. So there's lots of education and fundamentals, you know, getting ARC to have a look at the site, see what the fundamentals are like, and definitely +1 to doing that sort of stuff before paying for a big manual audit, because you want to catch the problems that are easily caught first, the low-hanging fruit. I think this next thing I'm going to suggest is heavily caveated with, you probably want to do a lot of education first and you want to really understand the disability awareness aspect. But if you happen to be in probably a larger organization that already does usability testing with people, you may want to look into including people with disabilities in that usability testing. I would only really suggest that if that's a place where you already are to build on. If you haven't done testing with real people before, then that's probably falling for now under the taking on too much at once category. But there's no substitute for getting the feedback of the people who are going to use your product, and people with disabilities are almost certainly going to be in that group. There's a lot to consider. I think we actually have a training module around some of this at least. There's a lot to consider in terms of the accessibility and the inclusiveness of the test, the place where the tests are going to be, the environment, all that sort of stuff. It's a really big area. I wouldn't suggest you take it on, just like that. But if it's something that you could build towards because you're already doing testing with people, definitely worth looking into, and maybe consulting people like us if you want, advice on how to make your user testing accessible to people with disabilities. That's something that can really help. There's nothing motivating like watching somebody struggle to use the thing that you made. So again, on the evangelism front, but as well, I would only suggest doing this once you've gone through those initial sort of, do I have something that's at a usable level to start with? Because it's probably, it's not respectful of people's time or the hassle of them getting to the testing if they're not going to be able to use it at all. But if you're kind of, already quite mature in terms of usability, that's another direction that you might want to go in sensitively.
Don't ask somebody to test drive the car if you haven't bolted on the wheels first.
Yeah.
Or if the brakes don't work either. That's not very nice.
Awesome. Well, I know we're all over time. Appreciate everyone joining us today. Mark and Matthew, thank you for answering these awesome questions. And
thanks, everyone.
If everyone liked this, then maybe we'll do this again.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, appreciate all of
you.
You. Thank you all for coming, and I hope that was helpful, and I hope we answered your questions okay.
All right. Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.